Right. Hello, everybody. Again, we're here. It's 6 o'clock. It's a Saturday. But for us who are on, isolation, it doesn't feel like any other day. Woo, the weekend. Great. Continuing our escapade of baked goods. Yesterday we had muffins. Today we have flapjack. It was very, very good. Gareth made it. It was very good.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to read. By the way, we can't keep this up for the whole of the 30 days because, we'll be like as big as houses if we do that. But now I'm going to read from chapter 3 of my book, Walking on Cinders, which is 10 years old this year. Chapter 3. Across London's East End, where the River Thames met the swirling expanse of new suburbia, life had taken on a relatively normal pattern, and the day-to-day humdrum of modern existence passed by without notice. Marking the middle of this dark land of grey roof tiles and blackened chimney pots was the ageing Stadium of the Sun. Now cracked and broken, the paint peeling, the stadium had once been the love of the capital when it was commissioned for the 2012 Olympic Games, but now it stood alone and deserted. The Olympic village that surrounded it had since been converted into flats and student accommodation. The stadium itself, used by the hundreds of football leagues that had grown from the rubble of the FA. People across the country supported their local teams, but there was very rarely any overall outcome to the various competitions. If you walked past the Stadium of the Sun and headed north along Churchill Lane, turning left into Blair Avenue and right into Cameron Drive, you would reach a stone water fountain. The fountain had been designed as a monument to the armed forces and was surrounded by a series of neatly mown lawns, plotted flower beds and white speckled gravel. The ceremonial garden itself had been commissioned by the Prime Minister as he left office in the year 2013, and it had paved the way for more of the same design to appear during the decades that followed. It was, however, more important now to have monuments that honoured the nation's troops as a whole, and these single stone fountains had since been forgotten. Cameron Drive, though, was the location of the original fountain, and that made a difference. This particular monument marked the entrance to the East London and Thames Regimental Barracks. The barracks themselves were cold in the contrast to the warm sun of the afternoon. The dark colours swallowed the brightness and it fell, so that the lightest part of the complex was a single grassy courtyard that marked the centre. The courtyard was alive with the colours of the season. Greens and blues and reds danced in the breeze, and it was surrounded on three sides by the rooms of the various occupying soldiers. The location then became a haven from the strict discipline. The location then became a haven from the strict discipline that existed within the barracks walls. It was on one such afternoon, when the sun was high in the sky and a shadow was cast on the ground beneath the oak tree in the furthest corner, that three men had decided to stop beside a window. The fresh air provided an escape from the sticky and humid interior, and the three were deep in conversation. The breeze blew silently across the top of the open courtyard, and ruffled the dry leaves that nested in the guttering, sending them fluttering to the edge of the neatly mown lawn. One of the men checked towards the door that led back inside. He was sure he could hear someone moving behind that wall. But, satisfied that nobody had actually ventured into the courtyard itself, he turned his gaze back in the direction of his comrades. "I hear we're jetting off tomorrow. It's a mission that they don't want anyone to know about," said the man on the left. He was in his late 20s and he wore a dark green baseball cap far down on his head. Beneath it could be seen the rough stubble and tired lips that showed he had already done battle in some hot foreign country. "It's probably just a routine posting like all the others," spoke the second. He was a lot younger and his face showed no scars. As a new recruit, he was surely about to see his first instance of real combat. "I disagree," piped up the third and final member of the group. "If they haven't made it official yet, then it's got to be something dangerous, or stupid. Either way, it doesn't look all that favourable for us." Both the others turned and looked at their friend. They were aware that he was intelligent and so an automatic candidate for leader, but secretly both wished they had possessed the ability and his thirst for knowledge. And they were right to do so, for Chris himself had experience of the trouble they might be letting themselves in for. It was something that he did not want to mention, though, quite yet. Staff Sergeant Chris Aston enjoyed the responsibility that came from being in charge. He hoped one day to join the SAS and honour the glory of the parachute regiment. But when the opportunity would come along, he did not know. It was the hottest summer on record, 1 year before war would break out across the world, and Chris Aston had just completed his pass papers, which marked the conclusion of his education. He had achieved a merit in law studies and 2 distinctions in general sciences and world history. All of his lecturers considered Chris as someone who could go places and could have any job that he chose. But the grades didn't mean anything to Chris, who had always been adamant about his future career, and he knew he could do it with the best grades in the world or with the worst. It didn't matter. Chris wanted to be a soldier in the SAS, but there was one thing that stood in his way. He was still only 17 and he needed his parents' permission. Chris being Chris, he didn't let this get in his way. 2 weeks after receiving his exam certificates, the time fell right to do something about it, and Chris wrote a letter to his parents. The letter he had dreaded so much. "Dear Mum and Dad," it began. "I love you both. Please don't worry about me while I work out how to follow my dream. I've taken my savings and for a while I will be staying with Grandma and Grandpa. I'll ring you when I've sorted myself out. Christopher." And that was that. Chris left home and was a free man. It was a strange feeling, especially for someone who was still so young. The long lanes that led to River Cottage wound peacefully in the late afternoon sun. Chris had taken the train to get this far, and now he was almost a breath away from gaining that final permission. His grandpa would sign. He knew he would. A blackbird landed on the tarmac just in front of him. It hopped to the grass verge and tugged a worm from between the blades. It was an inspiring sight, and one that made Chris wonder what he would miss most when he was serving overseas. The London Royals was one of the best regiments in the world, and it was almost certain that with the Royals he would tread the sands of some far-off country. What he didn't realise was that it would happen quite so soon. The old wooden gate at the edge of the garden creaked slowly open, and Chris was immediately met by his grandma's open arms. "Chris," she said, "we've been so worried. Your parents have phoned and everything." "Valerie, do be quiet," came Ron's voice from behind. "I know why you're here, young man," he continued, addressing Chris directly now, "and I am proud of you. I'll gladly sign your papers, and I'm sure you will serve your country well." "Oh yes, but before you go off gallivanting to London, you must stay here a few nights and rest. You need a good home-cooked meal inside of you. You'll certainly miss that when you're away," said his grandma. And it was at that moment that Chris realised he really would. He would miss his family, the food, and the British way of life that was like no other. But at the same time, he would be serving his country, and the thought of this made him happier than anything else possibly could. 2 weeks later, Grandpa Ron had signed and promised, as he did so, and Chris was on his way. By the time he reached London, the papers had already been forwarded by wireless, and so, with only the money in his back pocket and a mind full of dreams, he headed for the Thames Regimental Barracks and for the life that lay beyond. Wondering now, Chris studied his comrades up and down. The 3 most definitely made an odd grouping, but it was Thomas who intrigued Chris the most. He always wore that dark green baseball cap far down on his head, even in the depths of winter. It was as if he was shielding his eyes from some strange invisible enemy that neither of the others could see. He always complained that the light was too bright and it made funny faces. And he made funny faces whenever a photo was taken. It must be his reaction to the light, Chris had thought after the same thing happened on their passing out parade. Now he had a record of his dear friend standing with him, sword in hand, cap against his chest, and mouth wide open. Chris had always believed that Thomas would never make it through the tough regime. They had met on the first day of training. Thomas was short and tubby, where Chris was tall and lean. They were almost the complete opposites, and yet here they were, standing in the courtyard, ready for what was sure to be the most important posting of their lives. While Chris Aston was taking his final exams, Thomas Fisher was at the helm of his father's business. It was a factory that made clocks, and Thomas generally loved his job. A few years earlier, his father had been taken ill, and as a result, he had retired from his position as head of the company. Almost immediately, Thomas had taken up where his father had left off, and it had been that way ever since. He enjoyed this new challenge. The workers respected him, and he, in return, provided them with good wages and working conditions. He was fair, but had a firm hand all the same. It was on one particular grey and dismal morning, when the sky was filled with a strong sense of approaching rain, that Thomas Fisher was late for work. Because of his position, he did not need to be on time, but he liked to be punctual all the same. This morning, however, had been a catalogue of disasters, and Thomas had resigned himself to the truth that today he would just not make it. Well, the entire town seemed to be running slower than usual. The traffic tailed back up Main Street, well past the Church of the Holy Trinity, where Thomas often attended a Sunday service, and many of the shops and businesses that stood on each side of the road lay cold and dark, their shutters still closed with no sign of life behind. The problem soon became clear. Two men were standing in a deep hole in the middle of the road, whilst another, dressed in a green reflective jacket, which seemed only to attract the motorist's rage, spun his stop-and-go sign on a tall pole and waited for the vehicles to snake by. Eventually the traffic lights shone green, then orange, then red, and slowly the tailback started to ease. On the third change of lights, Thomas managed to make it through, his frustration clearing as he continued on his way. Driving onwards down the country lanes and winding single-track roads that led to his empire, Thomas Fisher quickly began to make up time. But what he did not realise was the urgency with which his late arrival was being questioned up in his office on the 3rd floor. There, two men waited patiently, dressed in green and black, wearing berets of the royal badge. There was a letter there also on the desk, unopened, ignored. Real life was catching up with Thomas Fisher. At the factory, he parked his car in the reserved bay close to the entrance and made his way up the stairs towards the office. Marking the halfway point was a large glass window which allowed him to look out on the workforce below. Today, things appeared to be carrying on as normal. The conveyor belts were brimming with the watch and clock parts, and people were sorting them into piles, while slow-moving robots assembled the final products. Thomas continued past the window, for there was no need to pause here today. He opened his office door with a click and saw immediately the two men in uniform. For a moment he hesitated before turning towards his desk and realising why these men were here. On the side table was a letter, an important document detailing the requirements of national service. Thomas opened it and read from top to bottom, twice. He knew what it meant, for it had been all over the news. In these troubled times of conflict, reputable young men from across the country were receiving such letters of conscription, and within a month they were being transported to the front line. But why him? Surely he could not be considered soldier material. He had a good head for business, but this role at the factory would be of little use in the armed forces. Slowly lifting the engraved ink fountain pen from the desk and thinking of how he might fight for the good of England, Thomas Fisher signed his name on a dotted line, in flowing handwriting, much to his own surprise. The two men watched and waited. They would take the letter back to headquarters, to London, and to the Chief of the Defence Staff. Once they had left, Thomas Fisher silently locked his office door and fell, face in hands, into an old armchair. He really had signed away his life. 1 month later to the day, Thomas arrived at the Thames Regimental Barracks in London. He was briefed on the ongoing conflict in the Middle East that would eventually lead to war, of which they were all now an important part. Thomas would fight many a battle in the years to come. Modern civilization was entering a dangerous stage, and he knew that the conflicts would not end in the near future. He trained every day for the pitfalls of the future that might await him. He learned how to fire a gun, how to use other weapons, how to escape an advancing enemy without becoming a target, and about life on the battlefield. The first part of his service was gruelling, but it was not exactly dangerous. When the time came for a proper battle, Thomas would suffer greatly at the hands of the enemy. Reformed terrorist organisations grew strongly in the early war years, using improvised explosives to attack united governments. They aimed to damage as much capitalist power as possible. The larger groups were based in Eastern Europe, and they concentrated their efforts on the United Ireland of Great Britain, and of course the United Lands of America. Thomas Fisher's mother was a barrister for the county council, and his father, upon retirement from the company, had taken on part-time work. As part of their new roles, Thomas's parents had drawn up a home security bill, which aimed to control the illegal movement and travel of reformed citizens for work purposes. Following local trials, this bill had been recommended to the United government. They wanted to use it nationwide. While fighting overseas, Thomas liked to keep up with news from home. 2 months after he had been drafted into the Iranian border force, his parents and their colleagues were called to London to discuss the induction of the new law, the law for the protection of the united workforce. But the terrorists were bitter in their quest for destruction, and they had martyrs already in the country. They were not happy with this introduction of working caps. A year and a half after he had signed on the dotted line, Private Thomas Fisher received a standardised government letter. It came, as such letters did, with the Thames Regimental stamp and a London postmark, but what was written on those pages would haunt him for the rest of his life. It conveyed in very blunt terms the news that his parents had been among those killed in an explosion on board a privately hired train travelling on the outskirts of London. Eastern European militants had since claimed responsibility for the attack, and arrests were being made. He was expected to take solace in the fact that, like him, his parents were doing their very best for the country and its war effort. It did not help. Chris looked at his friend again. He could never really understand the memories that were hidden in Thomas's mind. From the outset, it had created a wall between the man and the rest of the world. The baseball cap was a physical marker of this. However stupid Thomas' decisions sometimes were, however hard he tried, there was still an air of distraction about him. He would fight hard when the battle required it, and Chris knew he would never give up in the face of a defiant enemy. His skills may soon be put to the test, Chris thought, as he considered what the position might be by the time the day was out. We might again have to fight together and almost certainly die together far sooner than he thinks. The final lad who made up this trio of brave soldiers was Ewan Roberts. He was different from the others in because he joined the regiment at a later date. He knew the others well. They had spent time together training in new forms of combat and had discovered a liking for each other. But, unlike his friends, Ewan's devotion to the cause had been roused completely by chance. London's West End was a marvellous place. Before the war broke out, it was thriving with visitors, coach parties and tourists. It was home to the big-time musicals. If you made it to the West End, you were bound to be a success. There were theatres on every street corner, each vying for the public's love, and there were many different musicals, plays, and sometimes comedies to choose from. But to Ewan Roberts, it had always seemed like one dream too far. Ever since he had passed his National Diploma in Media and Theatre Studies at the age of 16, Ewan had longed to be on the stage, longed to see his name in lights. Studying at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art provided a pathway to his first major audition. The Andrew Lloyd Webber Trust was presenting the 50th anniversary production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat in London's West End, and the director was searching for a talented young student who was interested in the lead role. At the auditions, Ewan had performed better than his expectations. He had to push his voice to the extreme, but he did well, and the director offered him the part. Now began the grueling schedule of 8 performances per week and the laborious task of keeping his voice healthy. The musical made a big profit, and well into the following year it went on. But on the outbreak of war, things changed at a very fast pace. London saw the biggest threat from the reform troop bombing, worse than any other European capital, and the government had to take action. Entertainment districts faced closure as each evening the lights were dimmed across the city. Many of the West End theatres were damaged in the nighttime raids, and slowly the actors started to leave, taking new jobs in the war economy or signing up to join the fighting themselves. It was in this way that Ewan Roberts finally found himself signing up to the Thames Regimental Barracks. Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat was the last of the big musicals to run in London. But on the Friday which marked the 1.5-year milestone for the production, the theatre was razed to the ground in one of the heaviest bombing raids ever recorded on the city. There were several deaths that evening, yet it was fortunate in a way that the blast had centred above the stage, and many of the audience were able to escape unharmed. The sets had fallen and the roof had collapsed, bringing several tons of heavy mechanical machinery down to the ground on anyone below. Staff Sergeant Chris Aston and Private Thomas Fisher were among the army personnel on duty that night, and they were more than surprised to find the famed Ewan Roberts held between 2 roof trusses that had fallen towards the top of the rubble. As Chris predicted, the poor man had spent many months recovering from his injuries, but the biggest surprise of all came during their routine training at the start of the new year. They were making their way around a tough assault course when a still recognisable Ewan Roberts strolled through the gates and headed straight for Colonel's private quarters. Chris had seen a dramatic change in the character of Ewan Roberts in the years since he had enlisted. The terrorists of war and Chris's own stories had removed the swagger from his character. Presently, he wondered what the day would really bring. "Come on, boys," he shouted, rounding the room in his own particular style and reaching down for his rucksack, his heavy case file. "Oh, we can't be waiting around here all day. We've got a colonel to please and some orders to be given." His tone was not in the least bit sarcastic. Chris, Ewan and Thomas had no idea what was waiting for them beyond the gates of a Thames Regimental Barracks, and no notion what they would be posted, and no notion of where they would be posted, or if they would even leave the country at all. The only thing they were sure of was that they had many more days of trouble before them, and as they headed onwards together, Chris knew there was a great danger and a sadness before them.